August 19, 1944, East Prussia. Inside the heavily guarded complex of Adolf Hitler's Wolfslair, senior officers of the German High Command were confronting a rapidly deteriorating strategic picture. Among them was General Oberst Alfred Jodl, poring over fresh intelligence summaries arriving from France. Reports from the Western Front confirmed what many in the Wehrmacht already suspected. German defenses were collapsing under relentless Allied pressure following the Normandy breakout. Yet amid the grim news, there appeared to be one remaining source of confidence. German analysts had turned to logistics, the unyielding mathematics that govern every modern army. Allied forces, particularly General George S. Patton's fast-moving Third Army, had advanced at a pace that seemed unsustainable. Their supply routes now stretched hundreds of miles from the Normandy beaches across bombed roads and damaged rail lines. According to German calculations, the Americans had pushed far beyond the limits of practical resupply. From decades of military experience, Jodl and his colleagues understood a hard truth: speed consumes fuel. A single armored division, when advancing aggressively, required enormous quantities of gasoline, well over 100,000 gallons each day. Patton's tanks and trucks were now operating far from their logistical bases. To the German General Staff, the conclusion appeared unavoidable. The American advance would soon stall, not because of enemy resistance, but because the fuel simply would not arrive. This pause, they believed, would give German forces precious time. Units could be reorganized, defensive lines re-established along the Seine, and perhaps the Western Front stabilized long enough to survive into the winter months. It was a familiar pattern. German doctrine had long emphasized the decisive role of supply lines. Blitzkrieg itself depended on rapid movement, but only as long as logistics could keep up. When they failed, even the most brilliant operations collapsed. Germany had learned this lesson the hard way. In the vast spaces of the Soviet Union, early successes had dissolved not due to immediate battlefield defeat, but because supply systems broke down. Trucks failed on primitive roads, rail networks were incompatible. And despite Germany's reputation for mechanization, most of its transport still relied on horse-drawn wagons that simply could not sustain high-speed warfare. What Jodl could not see from East Prussia was that the assumptions underlying his calculations were already obsolete. Hundreds of miles to the west, an unprecedented logistical effort was in motion. Nearly 6,000 trucks were rolling eastward in a continuous stream, engines running day and night. Contrary to traditional military doctrine, headlights remained on after dark to maintain speed. Roads were converted into a one-way circulation system dedicated solely to supply traffic. Every 24 hours, more than 12,000 tons of fuel, ammunition, food, and spare parts surged toward the front. This operation, soon known as the Red Bull Express, had no historical precedent. German military theory had never imagined that such volumes of material could be delivered so quickly over such distances using wheeled transport alone. It defied the logistical assumptions upon which the Wehrmacht's confidence rested. The backbone of this system was human as much as mechanical. Roughly 23,000 drivers kept the convoy moving, the majority of them African-American soldiers serving in segregated units. Working under extreme pressure, often with minimal rest, they transformed ordinary highways into the most efficient supply network the war had yet seen. Within 3 days, Patton's Third Army did not grind to a halt as predicted. Instead, fully fueled and resupplied, it smashed through German defensive positions along the Seine. Within a week, Allied forces entered Paris. Within a month, American troops reached Germany's frontier. The German High Command soon realized that its final Western Front calculation had been disastrously wrong. The failure was not tactical, nor even operational, it was conceptual. American logistics had rewritten the rules of modern warfare. The Wehrmacht's most experienced planners were forced to confront a new reality: industrial-scale mobility, backed by vast resources and flexible organization, could overcome distances once thought impossible. The lesson was delivered not by tanks or generals, but by trucks and by the soldiers who drove them. By the summer of 1944, senior German commanders in the West believed they were witnessing a familiar pattern, one they had seen before on the Eastern Front. In July, General der Panzertruppe Heinrich von Lüttwitz, who had assumed command of the 47th Panzer Corps 2 months later, recorded his assessment with cold confidence. The American army, he argued, was rushing headlong into the same trap that had once ensnared the Wehrmacht in Russia. The Allies' strength, in his view, was also their weakness. Their armies depended on machines, tanks, trucks, artillery, radios, and machines devoured resources. Fuel, spare parts, ammunition, rubber, and maintenance crews followed every mile of advance. The Americans had surged nearly 400 miles in just 1 month, an operational tempo that looked impressive on maps but terrifying when translated into tonnage. History, von Lüttwitz believed, offered a clear lesson: speed without supply ends in immobility. German intelligence officers carefully calculated American consumption rates. Their reports painted a grim picture for the Allies. A single M4 Sherman tank consumed roughly half a mile per gallon on paved roads, and far more when forced cross-country. A standard US infantry division required approximately 700 tons of supplies every day simply to function. An armored division demanded closer to 1,000 tons daily. General George S. Patton's Third Army was advancing with 12 divisions spread across a 60-mile front. By German reckoning, this meant a minimum of 12,000 tons of material every single day, hauled hundreds of miles inland from the Normandy beaches. The situation appeared mathematically hopeless. Roads had been bombed, bridges destroyed, railways rendered useless often by German demolition units retreating eastward. On August 20, 1944, General Major Siegfried Westphal, soon to become Chief of Staff to Field Marshal von Rundstedt, finalized his own analysis. Even under impossible assumptions, unlimited trucks, flawless roads, zero mechanical failures, the American advance could not be sustained beyond 48 more hours. Physics, he concluded, was immune to propaganda. Industrial power could not repeal the laws of logistics. 5 days later, at 2 p.m. on August 25, in a commandeered French chateau near Le Mans, a very different calculation was unfolding. Lieutenant Colonel Lauren A. Ayres of the U.S. Motor Transport Service faced a room filled with doubtful officers. Conventional supply doctrine had collapsed. Rail transport was unusable. Scheduled convoys and depot systems had broken under the pace of Patton's drive. Third Army was burning through fuel and ammunition faster than any force in modern warfare. Ayres did not dispute the numbers. He redefined the solution. "We will build a highway," he told them, "not of concrete but of motion. A continuous one-direction supply corridor stretching from Cherbourg and the Normandy beaches straight to the front lines. Trucks would operate 20 hours a day. They would not stop except for refueling or breakdowns. The goal was uncompromising: at least 12,500 tons delivered daily." The concept borrowed its name from rail logistics. A Red Bull shipment was an express load that outranked all others. The new system would operate under the same rule: absolute priority, nothing. What followed shattered German logistical doctrine. 2 parallel roads would be designated, one exclusively for loaded vehicles moving forward, the other for empty trucks returning west. Operations would continue around the clock, headlights blazing, blackout discipline abandoned despite the theoretical risk of air attack. Convoys would depart at 5-minute intervals, maintaining an average speed of 35 miles per hour. Mobile repair teams would be stationed roughly every 50 miles, while military police checkpoints would pull any vehicle traveling under 25 mph off the route immediately. Colonel Charles O. Thrasher, commanding the forward elements of the advanced section of the Communications Zone, ADSE, examined the projections. The plan demanded 140 truck companies, nearly 6,000 vehicles, operating at 90% readiness, a standard no logistics manual had ever deemed achievable. Yet within 36 hours, the system moved from theory to reality. On August 26, 1944, drivers of the 3,916th Quartermaster Truck Company climbed into their GMC CCKW 21 2-ton trucks, the legendary Deuce and a Half. Their cargo, 105mm artillery shells urgently needed by Patton's guns near Melun, nearly 300 miles east. Engines roared to life, headlights cut through the darkness, and the supply line began to flow. the human dimension of the Red Ball Express would have been incomprehensible to Nazi racial ideology. The vast majority of its drivers were African American soldiers, many operating under extreme fatigue, dangerous conditions, and relentless pressure. They drove day and night, often without rest, keeping an army in motion that German commanders had confidently declared impossible to sustain. Within days, the predicted paralysis never came. The laws of physics remained intact, but logistics, reimagined under pressure, had rewritten the outcome. By the time the supply network, later known as the Red Ball Express, reached full scale, nearly 23,000 drivers were assigned to keep it running. Roughly 3 out of every 4 of these men were African American soldiers serving in an army that was still officially segregated. These soldiers lived under strict racial discrimination. In large parts of the United States, they were barred from dining in white-owned restaurants, forbidden from using public facilities reserved for whites, and denied basic civil equality. Yet overseas, in the summer of 1944, they became the backbone of the operation that kept the most famous American generals and their armies moving across Europe. Almost immediately, the drivers forged a distinct culture of their own. Their trucks became moving canvases. Slogans appeared on bumpers and tailgates: Patton's Blood Bank, Hitler, We're Coming, Detroit to Berlin Express. These messages reflected pride, defiance, and a sense of purpose that went beyond official military orders. On the roads, they abandoned conventional rules and invented new ones. Any vehicle that couldn't maintain speed was expected to pull aside without hesitation. Broken-down trucks were shoved off the road into ditches. A vehicle traveling under 20 miles per hour wasn't just slow, it was treated as an obstruction. Efficiency mattered more than formality. By August 28, 1944, German reconnaissance units began reporting something they had never encountered before. Observers from units such as Aufklärungsabteilung 116 transmitted urgent radio messages after monitoring the main Red Ball route. Their descriptions bordered on disbelief. They reported an unbroken stream of vehicles, headlights blazing, visible for nearly 20 kilometers. There was no spacing between trucks, no blackout procedures, no attempt at concealment. Traffic density was estimated at up to 1,000 vehicles per hour. From the German perspective, it appeared that the Americans had completely abandoned every basic rule of military movement. This behavior contradicted everything taught in German doctrine. Night driving with headlights exposed columns to air attack. Continuous convoys created ideal targets for artillery. Tight spacing meant a single disabled truck could paralyze an entire supply line. Yet the American convoys showed no concern for any of this. On August 30, General Edgar Fuchsinger, commander of the 21st Panzer Division, personally observed the Red Ball Express from concealed positions. His report to Army Group B revealed growing unease. He wrote that the enemy had constructed a supply system beyond German comprehension. Trucks passed every 30 seconds, day and night, without interruption. They neither dispersed nor concealed themselves. They followed no recognizable operational logic. Fuchsinger concluded that what he was witnessing was not traditional military logistics, it was industrial mass production adapted to warfare. What German officers failed to grasp was that American logistics followed an entirely different philosophy. German planning emphasized conservation, concealment, and rigid procedures. The Americans prioritized scale, redundancy, and speed. Where German planners worked to preserve every vehicle, American logisticians assumed that around 20% of trucks would fail mechanically and built that loss into their calculations. Where German units followed strict manuals, American drivers constantly adapted, adjusted, and improvised. The performance of the Red Ball Express shattered German assumptions about what was logistically achievable. During its first week of operation, from August 25 to August 31, 1944, the system delivered 89,939 tons of supplies to the advancing front. That translated to a daily average of 12,848 tons. Each round trip covered approximately 686 miles. Nearly 6,000 trucks rotated through the system, with most completing 1.5 trips per day. Ironically, the operation consumed 300,000 gallons of fuel just to sustain itself. German logistics officers later obtained these figures from captured American documents. They dismissed them outright, labeling them exaggerations or psychological warfare. The numbers seemed impossible within the framework of German planning. But the figures were accurate, and the flow was increasing. By September 5, the Red Ball Express had reached a pace that stunned German specialists, many of whom still depended on horse-drawn transport for roughly 80% of their logistical movement. Against this industrial torrent, traditional methods had no answer. What rolled past them on those French roads was not just a convoy of trucks, it was a new model of war. From the western starting point of the supply corridor, truck convoys rolled out with clockwork regularity, one every 5 minutes, day and night. Each convoy typically consisted of around 60 to 70 vehicles. Under standard conditions, a truck carried 5 tons of cargo, though in practice crews routinely exceeded limits, hauling as much as 7 tons per vehicle. The journey itself was punishing. A single run covered approximately 350 miles and required an average of 14 hours to complete. Upon arrival, vehicles were given only minimal downtime, roughly 2 hours at each terminus before immediately turning back. At any given moment, nearly 5,000 trucks were moving somewhere along the network, creating a constantly flowing river of steel, fuel, and manpower. This vast operation, later known as the Red Ball Express, became a living laboratory of improvisation. Hour by hour, drivers, mechanics, and officers devised solutions to problems that German military engineers had long judged impossible to overcome. Formal doctrine gave way to necessity, and necessity bred innovation. Mechanical failure was relentless. Roughly 1,800 trucks broke down every single day. To keep the system alive, mobile repair teams operated directly along the roadsides. Mechanics adopted a ruthless triage philosophy. If a vehicle could not be repaired within 15 minutes, it was pushed off the route to prevent traffic jams. Trucks beyond saving were stripped for parts, their components immediately reused to resurrect others. Even engine replacements were performed at astonishing speed. Using mobile cranes, crews could remove and install an entire engine in under an hour, often in just 45 minutes. When official routes became clogged with traffic, drivers did not wait for orders. They carved out detours through fields, villages, and ruins, creating unofficial bypasses on the fly. Manpower transport posed another challenge. To preserve trucks for cargo, American units commandeered French civilian buses to move troops. Enemy equipment was also repurposed. Captured German vehicles were repainted in olive drab and pressed directly into American service. When bridges lay in ruins, engineers and drivers together constructed makeshift crossings, packing rubble from bombed-out buildings into riverbeds to form passable roadways. To German observers, the entire system appeared chaotic, yet it functioned with astonishing efficiency. German logistics doctrine emphasized meticulous planning, strict maintenance schedules, and adherence to standardized procedures. The Americans ignored nearly all of these principles. Paradoxically, their supply network did not collapse under the strain. Instead, it accelerated. Perhaps the most unsettling revelation for German intelligence was fuel. The Red Ball Express alone consumed roughly 300,000 gallons of gasoline every day merely to sustain its own movement, an amount exceeding what many German formations received for all operational needs combined. Despite this enormous consumption, shortages never materialized. This was made possible by another unprecedented undertaking, Operation Pluto. Fuel pipelines were laid beneath the English Channel itself, delivering gasoline directly from Britain to the European mainland. By September 1944, fuel was already flowing through these underwater arteries, completely undetected by German intelligence. Along the Red Ball routes, forward fuel depots were established at intervals of roughly 25 miles. Tanker trucks operated in parallel convoy systems, ensuring that no vehicle waited more than 10 minutes to refuel. German Generalmajor Walter Warlimont, analyzing aerial reconnaissance photographs, struggled to grasp what he was seeing. In his assessment, American fuel depots alone exceeded the entirety of Germany's strategic reserves. He noted bitterly that the Americans were expending more fuel simply transporting gasoline than Germany allocated to entire panzer divisions. To him, this was no longer conventional warfare. It was industrial excess translated into military power. The logistical miracle had direct battlefield consequences. Traditional German calculations assumed that even under ideal conditions, an armored division could advance no more than 20 to 30 miles per day. American armored units supported by the Red Ball Express shattered those assumptions. Patton's forces routinely advanced 40 to 60 miles daily, sustaining this pace for weeks. On September 1, 1944, the U.S. 4th Armored Division provided a dramatic example. That morning, it advanced 35 miles, paused briefly at midday for resupply where fuel, ammunition, and spare parts were already waiting, and then surged forward another 32 miles before nightfall. A single-day advance of roughly 67 miles demolished German defensive planning, which had been built around far lower expectations. When reports of these movements reached General Oberst Heinz Guderian in East Prussia, he initially dismissed them outright. No mechanized force, he insisted, could maintain advances of 60 miles per day for an entire week. Mechanical breakdowns alone would make it impossible. To him, the reports could only be exaggerations, propaganda, or cases of mistaken identification. What German doctrine could not account for was a logistics system that defied tradition, one that thrived on improvisation, speed, and overwhelming industrial capacity. The Red Ball Express did not merely supply the Allied advance. It multiplied its momentum, transforming movement itself into a weapon. Intercepted American radio transmissions erased any lingering German doubts. What unsettled Wehrmacht commanders most was not merely the content of the messages, but the manner in which they were sent. U.S. units were transmitting their locations in plain language without encryption, displaying an almost reckless confidence in their operational speed. They clearly believed that by the time German forces reacted, the situation on the ground would already have changed. By early September 1944, specifically September 5th, German intelligence agencies had assembled a detailed and alarming assessment of what they now understood as the Red Ball Express. The conclusions were devastating. Established doctrines regarding American military limitations were rendered obsolete overnight. The report described behaviors that clashed violently with German military logic and training. American forces, the analysts noted, showed little concern for conserving equipment. Trucks that broke down were frequently left behind rather than repaired. Drivers remained on the road for days at a time, sustained by stimulants, violating every known principle of troop welfare and fatigue management. There was virtually no effort to conceal convoys, leaving supply routes exposed to air attack, yet such attacks never materialized. Mechanical failure rates reportedly reached nearly 30% per day, but this was rendered irrelevant by sheer numerical excess. Fuel consumption alone, the report argued, would have crippled any European army operating under scarcity. Field Marshal Walter Model's reaction captured the growing despair within German high command. After reviewing the findings, he reportedly remarked that if the intelligence was accurate, Germany was not confronting a better army but an entirely different societal system. The Americans did not hide because they felt no fear. They squandered material because they possessed it in seemingly limitless quantities. This, Model concluded, was not a challenge that conventional military tactics could solve. What German observers could not fully measure was the human cost behind this logistical machine. Red Ball Express drivers routinely remained behind the wheel for up to 72 consecutive hours. Exhaustion-induced hallucinations were common, exacerbated by widespread use of benzodrine. During the operational lifespan of the Red Ball Express, approximately 300 drivers lost their lives in accidents. Trucks crashed in dense fog, flicked on cratered roads, or caught fire when overheated engines ignited. Despite this, morale within the ranks remained remarkably resilient. The majority of these drivers were African American soldiersmen who returned home to segregation and denied civil rights. They understood the historical weight of their role. Every mile traveled and every ton delivered stood as a direct refutation of Nazi racial doctrine. They were acutely aware of what German ideology claimed about them, and that knowledge fueled their determination. Captured German officers later confirmed the profound impact of this logistical system. One such officer, Oberst Hans von Luck, taken prisoner in September 1944, reportedly told his interrogators that Germany's defeat became inevitable once they grasped the scale of the American supply network. He noted that the Americans appeared to break every established rule, burning fuel at obscene rates, discarding vehicles, pushing men beyond endurance, yet achieving success through overwhelming volume. Warfare, he said, had been transformed into an industrial process beyond German understanding. The psychological toll on German troops was severe. Soldiers at the front could hear American convoys moving throughout the night, engine after engine, supply after supply without pause. German infantry sometimes faced combat with only a handful of rounds per rifle, while US forces were delivering ammunition by the millions. The constant sound of truck engines became a form of unintentional psychological warfare. German engineers were equally astonished by the vehicles themselves. The GMC CCKW 21 2-ton truck, the logistical backbone of the Red Ball Express, embodied the power of American mass production. By the end of the war, General Motors alone had manufactured more than 500,000 of these trucks, exceeding the total number of all military vehicles available to Germany across every category combined. Technologically, the trucks surpassed German standards. Features such as all-wheel drive were standard, not optional. They incorporated centralized tire inflation, extensive waterproofing that allowed deep water fording, engines capable of running on low-grade fuel without modification, and functional heating systems that actually worked in winter conditions. Even more striking was the American approach to maintenance. German doctrine emphasized skilled master mechanics rebuilding engines piece by piece. The Americans took a different route. They replaced entire engines. Where German units hoarded spare parts, American units discarded whole vehicles over relatively minor faults. Instead of relying on a few elite specialists, the US fielded vast numbers of adequately trained mechanics capable of completing the majority of repairs quickly. As Allied forces pushed eastward, the Red Ball Express adapted with a speed that stunned German planners, who were accustomed to long preparation cycles for logistical restructuring. When the original routes became insufficient, new supply corridors were established almost immediately. The White Ball Express linked Rouen to Paris. Green Diamond ran from Cherbourg to rail transfer hubs. Red Lion connected Bayeux to Brussels. The ABC route tied Antwerp, Brussels, and Charleroi together. Each new line became operational within roughly 48 hours of conception. German staff officers would have required weeks for comparable adjustments. The Americans simply painted fresh route markers, reassigned trucks, and resumed movement. The dominance of African American drivers within this system created an ideological crisis for Nazi racial theorists. Their doctrine proclaimed black soldiers incapable of technical proficiency, discipline, or initiative. Yet here they were operating one of the most effective logistical systems in military history, something German forces themselves could not replicate. The drivers recognized the irony. They understood exactly how the enemy viewed them, and that awareness only intensified their resolve to keep moving forward. Every kilometer covered by the long convoys moving across liberated France delivered a quiet but devastating rebuttal to Adolf Hitler's racial dogma. The Red Ball Express did not argue ideology with speeches or slogans, it dismantled it through results. Trucks driven, maintained, and commanded largely by African American soldiers proved hour after hour, mile after mile that Nazi assumptions about race collapsed under the weight of reality. German prisoners of war, often assigned to unload cargo or perform maintenance work, experienced this collapse firsthand. Many found themselves taking orders from black American sergeants who calculated load balances with remarkable speed, solved mechanical problems instinctively, and organized convoys with precision that exceeded anything they had known. Some of these soldiers spoke English more fluently than German instructors who had once lectured them, and they treated prisoners with a professionalism that contradicted every lesson Nazi propaganda had drilled into them about racial hierarchy. What made the Red Ball Express even more astonishing was not only who ran it, but what it built while operating at full speed. German planners had long insisted that large-scale logistics networks could not be created or repaired under active combat conditions. The Americans proved otherwise, as the convoys rolled day and night US. Engineers simultaneously constructed and reinforced approximately 40 bridges, established 15 major fuel depots, set up 26 maintenance and repair centers, and erected 8 temporary settlements designed solely to house and support drivers. None of this halted the flow of supplies. Everything happened in motion. One bridge, located near Monte, had been deliberately demolished by retreating German engineers. The Wehrmacht calculated that restoring a crossing there would take at least 6 weeks. American combat engineers completed a temporary replacement in just 14 hours. Meanwhile, Red Ball trucks diverted only a few meters off their route, using rough bypasses carved out by bulldozers almost as quickly as the drivers arrived. German engineering officers, watching from captivity, were stunned. They saw no lengthy planning conferences, no elaborate blueprints pinned to walls. Instead, there was immediate action, improvisation, and relentless momentum. The Americans rebuilt faster than the Germans had ever managed to destroy. Infrastructure seemed to appear overnight in open farmland. Roads, depots, and bridges emerged with a speed that defied European military logic. One achievement in particular left German artillery specialists deeply unsettled: the rate at which the Americans supplied ammunition. U.S. artillery units fired without the restrictions that had constrained every German battery since 1942. During the campaign to reduce the fortified defenses around Metz in September 1944, American heavy artillery unleashed approximately 100,000 shells in a single 24-hour period. The Red Ball Express delivered every round plus a surplus of roughly 20%. On the opposite side, German defenders were limited to about 50 rounds per gun per day. The contrast was brutal. American guns thundered continuously for hours, while German officers calculated that such sustained bombardment should have required dozens of truckloads of ammunition every hour. Yet the Red Ball Express supplied it without interruption. The scale of mechanical destruction within the operation itself was equally staggering. Trucks wore out at a pace no European army could have survived. Average vehicle lifespan dropped from the expected 30,000 miles to barely 10,000. Each day, nearly a third of the fleet was temporarily disabled. Every week, about 500 engines had to be replaced, along with roughly 10,000 tires. By late September, more than 5,000 vehicles had been destroyed or abandoned. Still, the system did not slow down. American industrial planning had already accounted for such losses. Cargo ships arrived weekly at French ports, each carrying hundreds of replacement trucks. New drivers were trained in as little as 2 days before being assigned to convoys. German analysts noted with disbelief that the Americans were losing more trucks per week than the entire German transport fleet in France possessed, yet American transport capacity continued to grow. What the Germans believed impossible had become routine, a logistics system that expanded faster than it consumed itself. Along the roads of northern France, civilians witnessed something they had not seen in years' abundance. The endless stream of trucks, fuel, food, and ammunition shattered the memory of scarcity imposed during occupation. The psychological impact was immediate. The Red Ball Express drivers, many of them African American, frequently shared their rations despite official regulations. At every halt, children gathered. Drivers handed out chocolate, soap, cigarettes, and food without hesitation. For French civilians, the contrast could not have been clearer. What the occupiers had rationed harshly and hoarded obsessively, the Americans distributed almost casually. The Red Ball Express did more than supply an army. It reshaped perceptions, broke myths, and demonstrated through action that an entirely different world had arrived. German intelligence assessments from late summer 1944 revealed an unexpected consequence of American logistics. Reports noted that the continuous flow of Allied supply convoys was reshaping civilian attitudes in occupied France. French civilians, once resigned to German control, had begun to believe that an American victory was unavoidable. To them, the endless columns of trucks were not just vehicles, they were evidence. Resistance networks drew confidence from these movements, and sabotage and partisan activity surged dramatically, increasing several-fold along the supply corridors known to the Allies as the Red Ball routes. Areas that had previously tolerated occupation now actively resisted it. By early September 1944, the Red Ball Express, the vast American truck-based supply system, encountered what appeared to be its breaking point. General George S. Patton's Third Army had advanced at such speed that even this massive logistical network struggled to keep pace. Supply runs that had once been manageable now stretched to distances exceeding 700 miles round trip. Drivers were pushed beyond exhaustion, trucks broke down at alarming rates, and the entire system showed visible strain. German intelligence noticed immediately. On September 8, reports reached senior command describing a supply network under stress. Convoy spacing had widened, average speeds had dropped, and delays were becoming noticeable. To German planners, this seemed like the long-awaited vulnerability. They believed the American advance was finally outrunning its lifeline. Yet once again, American adaptability confounded those expectations. Instead of collapsing, the system reinvented itself. Within 3 days, the Red Ball Express underwent a rapid reorganization. Intermediate depots were established, cutting individual driving distances roughly in half. Driver rotation schedules were introduced to combat fatigue. Forward repair and maintenance facilities appeared closer to the front. The number of trucks assigned to the operation was dramatically increased. Rather than slowing down, the system accelerated. By September 12, total daily deliveries had risen instead of fallen. What was expected to halt Patton's advance instead reinforced it. The crisis strengthened the logistical machine rather than breaking it. At the same time, American forces introduced an additional solution that German planners had considered unrealistic on such a scale: large-scale aerial resupply. Transport aircraft, primarily C-47 seconds, began delivering essential supplies directly to frontline units. Each aircraft carried approximately 3 tons per flight. On September 16, German observers counted nearly 900 transport sorties in a single day, delivering an estimated 2,700 tons by air alone. This figure stunned the German command. At its absolute peak, the Luftwaffe had managed only about 300 tons per day during the Stalingrad airlift, and that effort had been regarded as the upper limit of what was possible. The Americans, by contrast, treated transport aircraft as extensions of their truck network. Losses were anticipated and accepted. Escort concerns and fuel limitations were secondary. The strategy relied not on perfection but on overwhelming scale. German industry and logistics simply could not match this numerical reality. Equally unsettling to German observers was how the Red Ball Express was commanded. The operation functioned according to principles that violated traditional German military hierarchy. Decision-making authority was pushed downward. Junior officers routinely made choices that, in the German system, would have required approval from senior generals. Non-commissioned officers oversaw logistical efforts larger than those typically managed by high-ranking German field officers. From the outside, the system appeared chaotic. There was no rigid central command visible at every level. Instead, initiative flowed freely. Every lieutenant acted with the authority of a general, every sergeant with the responsibility of a colonel. According to German doctrine, such decentralization should have resulted in disorder. Instead, it produced speed, flexibility, and efficiency advantages the rigid German command structure could not replicate. By October 1944, newly repaired and advancing rail lines began to assume much of the logistical burden, gradually reducing reliance on the Red Ball Express. What had originally been planned as a short 10-day emergency operation had continued for nearly 3 months. Over 82 days, the system delivered more than 412,000 tons of supplies and moved them across hundreds of millions of ton-miles. As German forces were pushed back toward their own borders, senior commanders reflected on what they had witnessed. Field Marshal Walter Model later summarized the experience in stark terms. American victory, he concluded, had not been driven primarily by tanks or aircraft, but by transport capacity. The war had been decided by trucks. The logistical achievement extended beyond roads. While the Red Ball Express was still operating, American railway engineers rebuilt more than 1,000 miles of destroyed French rail infrastructure. Often working faster than retreating German forces could demolish it, they laid track using captured German equipment and rapidly restored rail transport to the front. The final statistics of the Red Ball Express defied every German logistical model. The operation employed an average of nearly 6,000 vehicles, peaking at around 7,000. Approximately 23,000 drivers participated. Daily fuel consumption reached 700,000 gallons. Patton's army alone received 40,000 tons of ammunition through the system. Millions of rations and vast quantities of medical supplies were delivered without interruption. When German officers later reviewed these numbers in captivity, many admitted their assumptions had been fundamentally flawed. They had estimated American logistical capacity by extrapolating from European standards, multiplying their own best performance several times over. Even then, they had underestimated reality. The actual American capability exceeded their calculations by an order of magnitude. Beyond the raw figures, the Red Ball Express accomplished something less measurable but equally decisive. It shattered German confidence in their own military superiority. It demonstrated that in modern warfare, logistics is not merely a supporting function, it is strategy itself. For much of the war, senior officers in the German Wehrmacht held a dismissive view of the United States Army. They believed American forces relied excessively on machines, lacked resilience, and would falter under sustained pressure. That perception did not survive contact with reality. As Allied forces pushed across France in 1944, those same German officers watched something unfold that overturned decades of military assumptions. An industrial-scale logistics system powered not by elegance but by relentless persistence and material abundance. In prisoner-of-war camps, German soldiers often gathered near the fences, silently observing endless columns of Allied supply trucks roaring past. Many counted them out of habit, some stopped counting altogether. A few reportedly broke down in tears. What they were witnessing was not merely resupply, it was a demonstration of economic warfare in motion. The Americans were not just sustaining their armies, they were consuming resources at a pace Germany could never hope to match. With each passing convoy, the German belief system eroded, axle by axle. This massive supply operation, known as the Red Ball Express, also exposed a deep contradiction within the US Army itself. While the system became the backbone of the Allied advance, its success relied overwhelmingly on African American soldiers. These men served in segregated units, endured systemic discrimination, and were barred from frontline combat roles. Yet they were entrusted with the most critical logistical mission of the campaign, keeping the advance alive. In September 1944, Supreme Allied Commander Dwight D. Eisenhower visited Red Ball Express operations personally. What he saw left a visible impression. His aide, Captain Harry C. Butcher, later noted in his diary that Eisenhower stood for a long time watching black drivers who had been on the road for nearly an entire day without rest. Eisenhower reportedly remarked that these soldiers were contributing to victory as decisively as any combat unit, and that the Army would eventually have to confront the implications of that reality. The operational success of the Red Ball Express intensified internal pressure within the US military to reassess segregation. The evidence was undeniable. In France, African American troops demonstrated under extreme conditions that, given proper equipment and responsibility, they performed at the highest level. For them, the Red Ball Express was their battlefield, and they mastered it. Within a few years, these experiences became part of the foundation that led to the desegregation of the US Armed Forces. German racial ideologues found themselves unable to reconcile what they observed. Nazi racial theory had no framework to explain disciplined, skilled, and indefatigable African American soldiers operating the most effective logistics network of the war. Rather than revise doctrine, SS-affiliated publications quietly ceased discussing American supply operations altogether. The contradiction was too stark, and acknowledging it too dangerous. After the war, German military analysts adopted a very different approach. Engineers and logisticians studied Red Ball Express operations in detail, treating them as case studies in modern warfare. The conclusions reshaped global military logistics thinking. Sheer volume, they concluded, could compensate for inefficiency. Redundancy reduced systemic fragility, decentralized command accelerated execution, standardized equipment multiplied effectiveness. And while human endurance had limits, those limits were far higher than pre-war doctrines had assumed. In 1950, Franz Halder, former chief of the German General Staff, summarized the lesson bluntly: strategy follows logistics, not the other way around. The Americans grasped this principle instinctively. Germany, he admitted, understood it only after defeat. Among the approximately 23,000 Red Ball Express drivers, countless acts of personal courage emerged, many of which baffled German observers accustomed to rigid command structures. Military records document hundreds of such incidents. Corporal John L. Houston, for example, remained behind the wheel for nearly 2 full days, repeatedly blacking out from exhaustion while delivering ammunition to the U.S. 2nd Armored Division near Cambrai. Fellow drivers revived him at stops, and he continued without protest. Another documented case involved Private Booker T. Washington, whose truck loaded with medical supplies caught fire due to overheated brakes. Regulations required immediate abandonment. Instead, he drove the burning vehicle 2 miles to a field hospital before leaping clear as flames engulfed the cab. The supplies he delivered were used to treat wounded soldiers from both Allied and Axis forces. To German analysts, these behaviors revealed something deeply foreign: a military culture that prioritized mission success over procedural perfection, empowered individual initiative, and accepted calculated risk as normal rather than exceptional. Late in 1944, German forces attempted to imitate the Red Ball Express under desperate circumstances. During the Battle of the Bulge, Operation Greif included plans to seize American trucks and use them to establish German supply routes. The attempt collapsed almost immediately. German drivers could not sustain American convoy speeds. Mechanics struggled to maintain unfamiliar vehicles. Fuel stocks evaporated at consumption rates Germany could not support. Most importantly, German planners lacked the American assumption that damaged equipment could simply be replaced. One German officer involved later reported that out of 50 captured U.S. trucks, more than half were rendered inoperable within days. The Americans would have written them off and issued replacements. The Germans attempted repairs they could not afford. That difference, he concluded, explained the outcome of the campaign. The winter of 1944-45 became the Red Ball Express's final and most severe trial. Ice, snow, and freezing rain should have halted wheeled transport entirely. German doctrine asserted that logistics vehicles could not operate below -10 degrees Celsius. Yet American convoys kept moving. Drivers changed tires, mixed alcohol into radiators, and pressed forward through blizzards. Speeds dropped dramatically, but deliveries continued. German observers reported long lines of ice-covered trucks advancing through conditions that had immobilized armored units. The system the Americans had built was neither refined nor fuel-efficient by European standards, but it worked under any terrain, any weather, and under constant threat. In the end, the Red Ball Express was not just a logistics operation. It was a demonstration of how industrial power, organizational culture, and human determination combined at scale could redefine modern warfare. And for those watching from the other side, it marked the moment when defeat became inevitable, one supply truck at a time. In the weeks following Germany's collapse in May 1945, Allied intelligence conducted an unusual exercise. A group of captured German logistics and staff officers were ordered to examine the Allied supply operation known as the Red Ball Express. The purpose was not interrogation but documentation, an attempt to understand how an advancing army had been sustained at a pace the German High Command had believed impossible. The findings deeply unsettled them. After reviewing the records, routes, vehicle losses, fuel consumption, and manpower requirements, the German officers reached a unanimous conclusion: they had encountered a form of warfare for which their doctrine had no answer. General der Infanterie Friedrich Schulz later summarized the assessment in stark terms. He described the Red Ball Express not as a supply chain, but as a self-contained temporary civilization, an enormous mobile system built solely to sustain combat forces. thousands of drivers, mechanics, engineers, and administrators operated tens of thousands of vehicles, moving unimaginable quantities of fuel, ammunition, food, and spare parts. Once the objective was achieved, the entire structure vanished, leaving little behind. What shocked German planners most was the contrast with their own approach. The Wehrmacht had relied on infrastructure constructed slowly over years, fixed rail lines, permanent depots, carefully rationed resources. The Americans, by contrast, assembled a superior logistical network in a matter of days, accepting waste, wear, and destruction as normal costs of speed. The most penetrating critique reportedly came from General Heinz Guderian, widely regarded as the intellectual architect of German armored warfare. He acknowledged that while Germany had pioneered blitzkrieg, it had never overcome its central weakness. Rapid maneuver was useless once fuel, ammunition, and spare parts failed to arrive. American industry, which German planners had dismissed as inefficiently excessive, had solved that problem outright. The Red Ball Express functioned less like a supply route and more like a continuous flood of material, one that overwhelmed German forces faster than they could respond. From a purely financial perspective, the operation appeared staggering. In 1944 alone, the United States spent roughly $100 million on the Red Ball Express. Thousands of trucks were worn out or destroyed, enormous quantities of fuel were burned, French infrastructure suffered extensive damage, later compensated through claims and repairs. To German officers trained to fight under chronic shortages, the numbers defied comprehension. To American planners, the cost was trivial. The logistical effort made possible the capture of approximately 400,000 German soldiers. It sustained the rapid liberation of France, Belgium, and Luxembourg. Most importantly, it accelerated the Allied advance to such a degree that historians estimate the European war ended roughly 6 months earlier than it otherwise would have. At the time, each additional day of war cost the United States around $250 million. By that measure, the Red Ball Express repaid its entire cost in a single day of shortened conflict. Lieutenant General John C.H. Lee, who commanded logistics for the European theater, expressed the philosophy bluntly. He noted that the campaign had consumed over 5,000 trucks and exhausted more than 23,000 men. In earlier wars, such losses would have been viewed as disastrous. In an industrial war fought by the United States, they were considered acceptable operating expenses. The consequences of the Red Ball Express did not end with the war. When the drivers and logistics specialists returned home, they carried with them practical experience from the largest transportation system ever assembled. Many went on to establish trucking firms, influence highway planning, and shape what became the modern American logistics industry. Companies such as Yellow Freight, Roadway, and Consolidated Freightways were founded or led by veterans of the Red Ball routes. They applied lessons learned in wartime France to civilian commerce, move in volume, prioritize speed over elegance, and keep vehicles in motion around the clock. American psychological operations units eventually recognized the unintended effect their logistics system had produced. To amplify it, they began broadcasting recorded truck engines toward German positions during periods of reduced movement. Reports soon followed of enemy units reacting to these convoys as if they were real. The illusion alone was enough to weaken morale, proving the depth of psychological damage inflicted by the supply network known as the Red Ball Express. By November 1944, as rail infrastructure was gradually restored, the Red Ball Express was officially shut down. But its significance did not end with its closure. Its methods permanently reshaped military logistics. The operation demonstrated a new philosophy: constant, high-volume supply delivery, inefficient by traditional standards yet overwhelmingly effective. Logistics no longer supported strategy, it defined it. Perhaps the most revealing innovation was how quickly the system vanished. In just 3 days, an operation involving tens of thousands of personnel, thousands of vehicles, and hundreds of support facilities was dismantled. Soldiers were reassigned, trucks redistributed, roads returned to civilian use. Comparable German operations, smaller and less complex, required months to assemble and years to dissolve. The American approach was different. Build exactly what is needed, use it without hesitation, dismantle it without sentiment, then replace it with something superior. After Germany's surrender in May 1945, multiple senior officers pointed to the Red Ball Express as a decisive factor in their realization that the war could not be won. During interrogation, one general remarked that the moment German leadership fully grasped the scale of American logistics, the outcome became inevitable. The Allies could replace supplies faster than Germany could destroy them. There was no effective countermeasure. Another senior commander, when asked what most impressed him about American forces, dismissed tanks and aircraft entirely. What astonished him, he explained, were the trucks. They revealed that the United States had converted its entire industrial base into a weapon. Germany was not fighting armies alone, it was fighting factories, assembly lines, and a society capable of sustaining war indefinitely. The final statistics of the Red Ball Express illustrate the scale of this transformation. Over 400,000 tons of cargo were delivered. Vehicles covered more than 120 million ton miles. Nearly 6,000 trucks operated daily, with peak usage exceeding 7,000. More than 23,000 drivers participated. The operation ran for 82 days, consuming 57 million gallons of fuel, wearing out 180,000 tires and destroying over 5,000 vehicles. Its cost reached approximately $100 million. Through logistical superiority alone, dozens of German divisions were rendered ineffective, and the war in Europe was likely shortened by several months. These figures represent more than operational success. They mark a turning point in the history of warfare. Tactical genius and battlefield brilliance no longer held primacy. Industrial capacity, logistical endurance, and organizational speed had become decisive. The Red Ball Express demonstrated that modern war would be won not only by soldiers at the front, but by the systems that sustained them, and that once logistics gained supremacy, strategy would forever follow its lead. In 1994, marking half a century since the Allied landings in Normandy, the United States Postal Service unveiled a special commemorative stamp at the National Postal Museum in Washington, D.C. Rather than celebrating a famous battlefield or a well-known general, the ceremony honored a massive logistical effort that history had long placed in the shadows of combat, the Red Ball Express. The event served as a long overdue acknowledgement of an operation that never fired a shot, yet shaped the outcome of the war in Western Europe. Veterans who gathered that day spoke not of medals or glory, but of endurance, responsibility, and quiet pride. They had participated in an effort that demonstrated how American industry, combined with personal resolve, could solve problems no doctrine or battlefield maneuver could overcome. Those drivers remembered days and nights spent behind the wheel with little rest, pushing forward despite failing engines, shattered suspensions, and roads reduced to mud by relentless weather. They drove when tanks could not move, when supply lines collapsed, and when exhaustion should have forced them to stop. Most of them were African American soldiers serving in a segregated army, often denied respect, advancement, or recognition. Yet mile after mile, at speeds averaging barely 35 miles per hour, they carried the fuel, ammunition, food, and spare parts that kept the Allied advance alive. The Red Ball Express permanently changed how modern warfare would be understood. It proved that logistics is not a secondary function supporting combat units. It is the central force that makes combat possible at all. The operation revealed that a democratic industrial society could generate and move resources on a scale that rigid, authoritarian systems could neither anticipate nor counter. German commanders, confident in their own operational brilliance, had dismissed American supply methods as inefficient and excessive. That confidence vanished as thousands of trucks poured across liberated France. At its peak, nearly 6,000 vehicles moved approximately 12,500 tons of supplies every single day along a dedicated route stretching hundreds of miles. What had once seemed chaotic became unstoppable. The German High Command had expected the Allies to advance slowly, carefully rationing fuel and ammunition, just as European armies traditionally had. Instead, they faced something entirely new, a rolling wave of material power. American forces did not pause to rebuild stockpiles, they created abundance on the move. The result was a logistical surge so overwhelming that it smothered German resistance under sheer volume. What made the Red Ball Express successful was not brilliant planning alone, nor flawless execution. It worked because of qualities the German military had consistently underestimated. American industry produced vehicles faster than they could be destroyed. Soldiers possessed mechanical skills that allowed them to repair trucks on the roadside with improvised tools. Drivers adapted routes, schedules, and methods on their own initiative, making decisions that, in the German army, would have required approval from the highest levels of command. General George S. Patton, whose Third Army depended heavily on the Red Ball Express, later reflected on this reality with rare clarity. In his memoirs, he credited the truck drivers as essential contributors to Germany's defeat. Without their constant movement, he wrote, his army could not advance. Without advance, victory was impossible. These men, largely ignored at the time and burdened by discrimination, had nonetheless carried the war forward. Their contribution stands as an undeniable historical truth. More than 23,000 drivers, most of them African American, kept thousands of trucks moving along a one-way highway of dust, mud, and danger. They achieved what German military theorists had labeled unrealistic and unsustainable. They maintained operational speed beyond what was believed humanly possible, and supplied advancing armies faster than theory suggested could be done. In the end, the Red Ball Express delivered a lesson that still echoes through modern military planning. Wars are not won solely by superior tactics or battlefield brilliance. They are won by the side that can move more fuel, more food, more ammunition faster and farther than the enemy can stop. The generals who once mocked American logistics were ultimately defeated by it. And so, decades later, a small postage stamp carried a message far larger than its size. It recognized a force that history had overlooked and affirmed a simple reality. Victory often rides not on tanks or rifles, but on worn tires, tired hands, and the relentless motion of trucks that never stop moving. 82 days after their initial victories, the German commanders found themselves compelled to capitulate to forces supported by the Red Ball Express. It was a moment that crystallized a profound lesson. American logistical networks had proved more formidable than German armored divisions, industrial output had outpaced tactical genius, and the flow of supplies had become as decisive as battlefield maneuvers. The Red Ball Express ceased operations on November 16, 1944, yet its significance extended far beyond its final convoy. It demonstrated that in the modern industrial era, triumph on the battlefield is less a matter of individual heroism or brilliant command, and far more dependent on the nation capable of moving vast quantities of materials with speed and precision. German officers who had scoffed at the Americans' truck convoys in the summer of 1944 eventually signed surrender papers in May 1945, humbled by the relentless efforts of 23,000 drivers who had transformed logistical support into a weapon of war. What made the Red Ball Express remarkable was not elegance or efficiency by conventional standards. It achieved neither but sheer effectiveness. The operation kept the Allied advance continuous, forced German forces into a steady withdrawal, and underscored a modern military reality. The mobility of supply convoys can dictate outcomes more decisively than the concentration of tanks. The physical remnants of this campaign remain visible across France. Roads bear deep grooves from heavily loaded trucks, bridges were hurriedly patched to accommodate the relentless flow, and many vehicles abandoned along the roadside testify to the operation's intensity and scale. Yet, the most enduring testament is not found in infrastructure but in the acceleration of Allied victory. Every day shaved from the conflict saved countless lives. In this sense, the Red Ball Express effectively shortened the war by months. The lesson for military strategists was profound. While amateurs debate tactics, seasoned professionals understand the primacy of logistics, and in this case, Americans demonstrated the unmatched power of transportation. The Red Ball Express spoke through the continuous rumble of 6,000 engines, a mechanical chorus delivering both the tools of war and the promise of liberation at an average speed of 35 miles per hour along a dedicated route. A German officer whose name has not been preserved captured the essence of this realization during a 1994 commemoration. Observing the steady American convoy in Belgium, he remarked in halting English to his captives, "We anticipated your tanks, your air power, your naval strength. We never accounted for your trucks. How does one defeat an opponent who possesses more trucks than we have soldiers? The answer passed before him every 5 minutes, driven by exhausted Americans who were quietly reshaping the principles of warfare through consistent delivery. Ultimately, the Red Ball Express converted logistics into strategy, supply into decisive action, and ordinary trucks into a cornerstone of victory in Europe. German commanders ceased their ridicule only when it was too late to counteract its effects, by which point General Patton's forces, fully provisioned, were already advancing to their positions. The operation stands as a historic example of how industrial capability, relentless organization, and transportation infrastructure can redefine the very nature of military success.